The 2nd of January in Mesa can be a gentle kind of winter day, the kind where the light thins slowly over the rooftops and the air carries just enough coolness to make a child think about going back inside for a coat. On that Saturday in 1999, the neighborhood around East El Moro Avenue had the ordinary quiet of early evening, with driveways, block walls, parked cars, and the soft, familiar sounds that families come to know without thinking about them very much. You can imagine standing there now, not as someone arriving at a scene, but as someone walking carefully into a memory that other people have carried for years, trying not to disturb it more than necessary. Mikelle Diane Biggs was 11 years old, small for her age in the way many children are small before a growth spurt, and the public descriptions would later reduce her to the details investigators needed most: her height, her weight, her hazel eyes, and the clothing she had been wearing that day. But before those details became part of a missing person file, before they were printed on notices and repeated in news reports and typed into databases, they belonged to a child in a red shirt with a white stripe, riding a bicycle in the fading light near home. Her younger sister, Kimber, was with her for part of that evening, and the story that has been told again and again begins with something almost painfully ordinary: the sound of an ice cream truck somewhere in the neighborhood. It was not a grand event, and it was not something anyone would have written down if the rest of the evening had gone differently, because children hear music from an ice cream truck, and they hurry toward the curb, and they wait with the expectation that a few minutes can be a very long time. When you begin to think like an investigator, you learn that ordinary details can become fixed points, not because they explain everything, but because they remain when almost everything else has softened. The bicycle, the street, the shirt, the hour, the sister going inside, the brief space of time when Mikelle was alone, these are the small stones laid across the water, and every person who has worked the case has had to step across them slowly. Some accounts place the moment around late afternoon, while the Mesa police listing describes Mikelle as last seen at approximately 6 o'clock in the evening. And that small difference of time is the kind of thing a patient investigator notices without rushing to make it larger than it is. Records change shape as they travel through years. Summaries become shorter than memories, and sometimes the work is simply to gather each version, compare it gently, and ask what is firm, what is uncertain, and what still needs the quiet pressure of another look. If you were arriving as one of the first officers, you would not yet know that the case would last for decades, and you would not know that people would still speak Mikelle's name more than 25 years later. You would know only that a child had been outside, near home, and that she could not be found, which is enough to change the temperature of a neighborhood almost at once. The early work of a missing child investigation is often made of movement, though later, when people remember it, they may remember the waiting more than anything else. Officers begin by checking the closest places first, because in the first minutes there is still the hope that the answer is near, that a child has wandered, or hidden, or gone to a friend's house, or followed the sound of music around a corner. Neighbors step out of their homes because they hear a parent calling, or they see police cars, or someone knocks on the door with a question that makes the evening feel suddenly unfamiliar. A street that had been background becomes a map, and each porch light, each side gate, each parked vehicle becomes something that must be noticed, because the first search is not a theory, it is care made practical. You might begin with the place where the bicycle was found, because an object left behind can feel like a sentence stopped halfway through, and investigators are trained to listen to those unfinished sentences without inventing the ending too quickly. The bicycle was there, and Mikelle was not, and for a long time that simple imbalance would sit at the center of the file, plain enough to describe, and yet impossible to resolve. There are cases where evidence speaks in a loud, unmistakable way, and there are cases where it speaks almost under its breath, leaving investigators to return to the same facts with different tools, different experience, and sometimes different humility. The Biggs case became the second kind, the kind where the emptiness around the evidence is part of the evidence itself, and where the most responsible sentence is often the one that begins with "we don't know." At first, though, there would have been no room for philosophical thinking, because officers, family members, and neighbors would have been moving through the practical tasks of the evening. They would check yards, speak to children, ask who had seen the ice cream truck, ask whether anyone noticed a stranger, Ask whether any vehicles seemed out of place, and write down answers that might look small at the time but might matter later. Investigating a disappearance like Mikelle's means learning to respect smallness, because the useful detail is not always dramatic, and sometimes it is a color, a sound, a direction of travel, or a memory someone did not realize they had preserved. You ask the same question in different ways, not to pressure people, but to help memory settle, the way dust settles when a room has finally gone still. The first night would have had its own rhythm, a rhythm made of doorbells, flashlights, radio calls, and the careful expansion of a search area. In a neighborhood like that, with homes close enough for children to know one another and streets familiar enough to feel safe, a disappearance can make every ordinary feature seem newly strange, though the work itself remains methodical. One address, one witness, one corner, one note at a time. You can picture a detective later opening a folder and seeing those earliest notes, the hurried handwriting, the timestamps, the names of people who answered doors, and the simple descriptions of where they had been. Each entry is a fragment of a larger evening, and the investigator's job is not to force the fragments into a perfect shape, but to preserve them well enough that the truth, if it comes, will have somewhere to attach. The family's memory of Mikelle remained deeply human, not a case number, not a poster, but a sister and daughter whose last ordinary moments were remembered in images of sunlit hair, a bicycle, and the expectation of a treat before dinner. That is one reason the case has stayed with people, because it began in a space so many families understand, the small distance between outside and inside, between play and supper, between a child waiting and a parent assuming there is still time. For investigators, that familiar quality is both helpful and painful, because the more ordinary the setting, the more carefully it must be examined. A busy road can produce witnesses, a store can produce receipts, and a public place can leave behind records, but a residential street at day's end may hold only what people happen to notice while making dinner, returning home, or listening absently to the sounds outside. In 1999, the tools available to investigators were not the tools a cold case unit might hope for now, and that matters when you imagine what the work felt like. There were no doorbell cameras on every other house, no easy map of cell phone movement, no neighborhood text threads filling with images within minutes, and no wide net of social media posts spreading a child's face across the country before midnight. Instead, there were phone calls, flyers, news broadcasts, interviews, patrol units, handwritten notes, and the physical labor of people searching because a child was missing, and every minute felt important. That kind of investigation depends heavily on presence, on people going into the streets, on people remembering what they saw, and on the slow accumulation of statements that may or may not ever point in the same direction. To think about the case gently is not to soften its seriousness, but to notice the human effort that gathered around it almost immediately. A missing child investigation asks people to become careful very quickly, and it asks a community to look at itself with unusual attention, because the answer, if there is one nearby, may be hidden in something that at first seemed too ordinary to mention. The sound of the ice cream truck became one of the enduring details, and details like that have a way of becoming symbolic after years have passed. It is easy from a distance to let the music become the whole story, but investigators have to resist that because a symbol can comfort the mind while also narrowing it too soon. So you would ask about the truck, of course, but you would also ask about every other movement on the street, every visitor, every errand, every person who might have passed through without belonging there. You would ask about routines because routines tell you what should have happened, and then you would ask about exceptions because exceptions sometimes show where the evening moved differently from its usual path. There is patience even in those first interviews, though it may not look like patience from the outside. It looks like asking someone to walk through the last hour again, then once more with the small details included, not because the investigator doubts them, but because memory often opens slowly when it is treated with care. A person might remember the sound before remembering the direction it came from, or remember looking through a window before remembering which child was on the bike, or remember a vehicle only after being asked where the sun was, what they were cooking, or whether the dog barked. These are not tricks, really, but ways of letting the mind return to a place where it has already been. As the hours moved into the next day, The investigation would have begun widening beyond the immediate neighborhood, because the longer a child is missing, the more the map has to expand. That widening is one of the difficult parts of the work, because every broader search can feel like admitting that the closest answer has not appeared, and yet it is also the responsible thing to do. Searches in those early days would have required coordination, and coordination is a quiet art that does not always appear in retellings. Someone has to decide which areas have been checked, which witnesses need follow-up, which tips have priority, which calls are duplicates, which reports are credible, and which weary searches need to be redirected before the effort becomes scattered. The public sees the flyers and the news stories, but inside the investigation there is also a structure of paper, boards, maps, logs, and names, each one asking to be maintained with care. If you are a detective in that room, you learn that a case can become large very quickly, and that once it becomes large, one of your duties is to keep it from becoming shapeless. Mikelle's description was repeated because repetition is how missing person cases travel, and the details had to be clear enough that a stranger could hold them in mind. 11 years old, Mesa, Arizona. Last seen on the 2nd of January, 1999. Wearing a red shirt with a white stripe and blue jeans, with designs a child, whose bicycle was found but who was not. Those words became functional, and yet behind them there was always the fuller child her family knew, the child no public notice could fully carry. That is one of the quiet sadnesses in an investigation like this, because the language of police work must be exact and minimal, while the person at the center of the file was never minimal at all. If you sat with the file late at night, years later, you might feel that difference very strongly. The forms would give you categories, the categories would give you order, and the order would help you work. But every so often, a photograph or a family remark would remind you that the file was not only a record of absence, it was also a record of love, continuing to look. The case drew many tips over time, and tips are their own weather system in a cold case. Some arrive in the first bright rush, when everyone is watching, and some come years later from people who saw a television segment, remembered an old neighbor, found a scrap of information, or simply could not let go of something that had troubled them. A patient detective learns not to resent tips, even when many lead nowhere, because a tip that proves wrong still has to be checked before it can be set aside. That is part of the weight of the work, the knowledge that every call might be the one that matters, and every call might also take hours away from another path that seems equally deserving. In a case like Mikelle's, where the central event was brief and the available physical evidence limited, the flow of information from the public became especially important. Investigators had to listen widely, but not carelessly, and they had to hold hope and skepticism in the same hand, which is harder than it sounds because both can distort a case when either one is allowed to stand alone. Hope can make a person see meaning where there is only coincidence, and skepticism can make a person miss the quiet truth because it arrived in an imperfect form. So the careful investigator tries to stand between them, patient enough to examine what comes in, and disciplined enough not to promise more than the evidence allows. Years later, one of the strangest publicized leads would involve a dollar bill found far from Mesa, carrying a message that claimed a connection to Mikelle. For a family and a community that had waited so long, even the possibility of a message could stir old feelings, but police eventually treated it as having no connection to the case, and in that too, there was a familiar cold case lesson. Not every new lead is a new path, and not every strange object is a doorway. Sometimes it is only another room the investigators must enter, look around carefully, document, and leave, returning to the older evidence with the same quiet obligation as before. That kind of disappointment can be hard to understand from the outside, because people often imagine a cold case as a locked box waiting for one bright key. But many cold cases are not like that, and the work is less like turning one key than like sorting thousands of small keys in dim light, knowing that most do not belong to the door, while still refusing to throw them away too quickly. The Biggs case also carried the pressure of public attention, not constant attention every day, but recurring waves that came on anniversaries, in television segments, in interviews, and in the renewed interest that old mysteries can gather when a community remembers. Public attention can help, because someone who knows something may finally speak, But it can also create noise because speculation travels faster than verification. For a detective, the public story and the investigative file are related, but they are not the same. The public story needs shape, while the file can tolerate uncertainty, and much of the patient work happens in that uncertainty, where notes remain open, names remain uncharged, and possibilities are followed only as far as the evidence permits. There have been persons of interest discussed publicly across the years, including a former neighbor whose name has appeared in media reports, but responsible investigation is not the same as public suspicion. To investigate someone is to ask whether facts support a path, and if they do not support it enough, or if they support it only partly, the file has to keep its careful distance from certainty. That distance can feel unsatisfying, especially to people who have waited decades for answers. But it is one of the moral duties of detective work. The investigator's loyalty is not to a theory, even a compelling one, but to what can be shown, tested, corroborated, and carried honestly into whatever future the case may have. You can imagine the years passing over the file in a storage room, not dramatically, but quietly, with new detectives coming into the department, older officers retiring, technology changing, and the city around East El Moro Avenue moving forward in the ordinary way cities do. Children who were Mikelle's age grew into adults, homes changed hands, cars disappeared from driveways, and still the file remained, waiting for the next set of eyes. Cold cases are sometimes described as sleeping, but that is not quite right because even when no public development is visible, a case can remain awake in the minds of family members and investigators. It may sit on a shelf, but it also sits in conversations, in anniversary calls, in private memories, and in the stubborn belief that time can change what is possible. Time changes witnesses, sometimes making them less certain, but sometimes making them more willing to speak. Time changes technology, giving investigators new ways to compare, preserve, search, and share information that earlier detectives could only have imagined. Time also changes the emotional shape of a case, because the urgency of the first night becomes something slower and heavier, not less important, but carried differently. Families learn to live beside the unknown. Detectives learn to return without expecting the file to greet them with easy answers. And communities learn that some questions become part of a place. If you were assigned to revisit Mikelle's case years after the disappearance, your first task would not be to solve it in one brilliant leap. Your first task would be to read, slowly, letting the early reports teach you what the first investigators saw, what they believed mattered, what they ruled out, and what remained unresolved when the trail thinned. You would read names of neighbors and officers, names of streets and schools, names of people who called in with tips, and each name would be more than ink, because each belonged to a person who occupied some small place in the case's long geography. You would learn the timeline as others understood it. Then you would learn the weaknesses of that timeline, because patient detective work is as much about knowing what you do not know as it is about repeating what you do. The timeline would return again and again to the short span when Mikelle was separated from her sister. In retellings, that span is often described as around a minute and a half, brief enough that people still struggle to understand it, though investigators know that very brief windows can matter in ways that feel almost impossible afterward. To work with such a window is to move carefully between probability and humility. You might ask what could have happened within that time, but you must also ask whether the time itself was remembered precisely, whether it felt shorter because panic compressed it, whether a minute was closer to two, whether the sequence was clear, and whether any small adjustment changes what was possible. None of that questioning is meant to fault a child witness, because Kimber was a child herself, and the last person to see her sister in an ordinary moment before the ordinary world gave way. It is simply the way investigators handle memory, tenderly when they can, rigorously when they must, and always with the knowledge that witnesses are human beings before they are sources of information. A child's memory may hold an image with extraordinary clarity while losing the exact arrangement of minutes around it. A detective who understands that will not treat memory as useless, nor will they treat it as a perfect recording, but will place it among the other pieces and ask how it fits. The street itself would become part of the investigation, because places hold possibilities and limits. You would look at how far the family home was from the corner where a vehicle could have stopped, which houses had a view, where a person might have been seen, and how the fading light on a January evening affected what neighbors could reasonably notice. You might stand there at the same time of day if you were able, not because the past can be recreated, but because the body understands distance and visibility differently when it is present. Walking the few yards that mattered, listening to the neighborhood sound around you, watching how quickly someone can move from one place to another, you might gain no answer, but you would gain a better respect for the question. That respect matters, because cold case work is often a struggle against simplification. People want the case to be one thing: the truck, the neighbor, the dollar bill, the 90 seconds. But a file like this is made of many things, and the truth may depend on how they overlap. There is also the matter of what was not found, and absence can be very hard to investigate. No clear path away, no confirmed explanation, no public resolution, and no single piece of evidence that has carried the case across the finish line. Absence asks a detective to remain attentive without becoming fanciful. It is tempting to fill empty places with stories, because the mind dislikes a blank page, but the discipline of the work is to mark the blank carefully and leave it blank until something real can be written there. In the years after Mikelle disappeared, her family continued to speak, remember, and hope for answers, and that continuity became part of the case's life. Families of missing children often become archivists without choosing to be, keeping photographs, dates, names, articles, and fragments of possibility, because no one wants the world to misplace the person they love. For investigators, a family's persistence can be both a reminder and a responsibility. The file is not simply old paper, because every call, every review, every anniversary conversation reaches someone who has been waiting for years, and that waiting is not abstract. When you imagine what it was like to investigate the Mikelle Biggs case, you might first think of police cars and search grids, but over time the image becomes quieter. It becomes a detective at a desk with a box open beside them, turning pages carefully, pausing over a name that appears twice, checking whether a phone number still leads anywhere, and wondering whether someone who was silent in 1999 might be ready, many years later, to say what they remember. It becomes the act of comparing old reports with newer databases, reading a witness statement made in the language of its time, then asking whether modern records can place a person, a vehicle, or an address more clearly. It becomes phone calls that begin gently because time has passed and people have lives. But the question remains, and sometimes the question has to knock again. A cold case detective must learn to approach people without assuming they have been waiting to talk. Some have forgotten details, some have moved away, some are wary, some are ashamed they did not say more, and some remember the case immediately because it has never quite left them. The investigator's manner matters in those conversations because patience can open doors that urgency closes. You say who you are, you explain why you were calling, you allow the silence after Mikelle's name, and you let the other person return to that January evening at a pace their memory can bear. Sometimes the person has nothing new, and sometimes what they offer is small: a correction, a name, a phrase, an old address, a recollection of a vehicle they are not sure about anymore. Small things are not dismissed, but neither are they inflated, and the detective returns them to the file, where they wait beside all the other small things. The case also asks investigators to think about the difference between attention and certainty. Media attention can make an idea seem stronger than it is, while a quiet lead buried in a report may deserve more care than anyone first realized. So, you read against the grain, not only following what earlier investigators emphasized, but looking at what they had to set aside because they lacked time, technology, or a reason to continue down that path. This is not a criticism of the earlier work, because early investigators were working under pressure with the tools they had, and cold case review often depends on honoring that work while also letting it be questioned. A file from 1999 carries the marks of its era. It carries the assumptions, limitations, and practical habits of that moment, just as a file opened today carries ours. That is why old cases sometimes benefit from new eyes, not because new detectives are wiser than old ones, but because they arrive with different tools and different patterns of thought. A detail that once seemed untestable may now be searchable. A name that once floated loose may now connect to a record, and a piece of information once trapped in one jurisdiction may now be compared more widely. Still, no technology replaces the older virtues. You have to read well, listen well, document well, and resist the desire to make the case more certain than it is. In Mikelle's case, the quietest fact may also be the hardest one, that she has not been found, and the public record still holds the case as unresolved. That unresolved status is not an ending so much as a condition, one that every investigator, family member, and careful listener has to sit with. To sit with it does not mean to give up. It means to understand that some work continues without applause, and that progress in a cold case can be almost invisible until one day a small verified fact changes the shape of everything. The neighborhood in Mesa has gone on being a neighborhood, as neighborhoods do, with bins rolled to curbs, mail delivered, school years beginning and ending, and new families learning the shapes of streets whose history they may not fully know. Yet for those who remember, the 2nd of January remains marked, not with noise, but with the kind of quiet attention people give to a date that changed the meaning of home. If you are the detective reviewing the case tonight, you close one folder and open another, and the room around you feels very still. There is no dramatic music, no sudden answer, only paper, memory, and the slow responsibility of trying again. The first folder may hold the basic identifying information, and you read it because every investigation begins by seeing the person clearly before studying the mystery around them. Mikelle Diane Biggs, born on the 31st of May, 1987, missing from Mesa, Arizona, on the 2nd of January, 1999, a child in a red shirt with a white stripe and blue jeans, last known near the place where she should have been safest. You do not rush past those details, because rushing past them would be a way of letting the case become abstract. Instead, you let them settle, and you remember that the facts were once part of a living afternoon, with air, light, movement, and ordinary family plans. Then you turn to the neighborhood canvas, the early witness statements, the search notes, and the calls that began arriving as the case became known. Each document has its own texture, and together they form the early shape of the investigation, the shape made before anyone knew which details would matter most. The first investigators had to move in many directions at once, which is one of the hardest things about the early hours of a missing child case. They had to search nearby and think far away, comfort a family and ask difficult questions, protect a possible scene while not losing time, and take public tips seriously, without letting the investigation dissolve into rumor. From a distance, people sometimes imagine that an investigation moves in a straight line, but the real work is more like walking through a dim house with many rooms. You enter one room, look carefully, return to the hall, enter another, compare what you saw, and keep doing that until the pattern, if there is one, begins to show itself. In Mikelle's case, one of those rooms was the question of opportunity. Who could have been close enough, familiar enough, or quick enough to reach her in that narrow space of time, and who would have known the rhythms of that street well enough to avoid immediate notice? Another room was the question of sound, because the ice cream truck music drew the children outside, or at least helped define why they were there. Was the truck itself located? Was the route known? Did anyone see it? Did anyone hear it from a different direction? And did the sound mean what the children believed it meant? A third room was the question of vehicles, because in many disappearances from a street, investigators look carefully at cars, trucks, vans, and anything moving differently from the neighborhood's ordinary flow. A vehicle can be seen and forgotten in the same moment, especially on a residential street, where passing traffic is not unusual enough to hold the eye. Then there were the people nearby, not as villains in a story, but as names to be checked, interviewed, cleared if possible, or kept in the file if questions remained. Good investigation is careful with people, because suspicion can injure when it outruns evidence, and because the truth is not served by turning every neighbor into a symbol. The public would later hear about certain individuals more than others, because media stories need focus, and because families too form beliefs from years of living with the case. But inside the work, the question is always narrower and more demanding. What can be supported, what can be tested, and what can be known well enough to act upon? That is one of the quiet burdens of investigating an unresolved case. You may feel something about a lead, and a family may feel something even more strongly, but feeling is not the same as proof, and the distance between them can remain painfully wide. So the detective keeps returning to the documents. The old pages do not change, but the reader does. And sometimes a line that seemed ordinary in one decade seems more important in another, because the surrounding knowledge has changed. A phone number that once led nowhere may connect to a relative. A name spelled one way in one report and another way in a second report may reveal a duplication. A location described casually may be mapped more precisely, and a timeline can be rebuilt with a patience that the first urgent days did not allow. This is the patient side of detective work, the part that rarely looks like action. It is sitting with uncertainty long enough to separate what is known from what has merely been repeated, and then doing that separation again because repetition can make even uncertainty sound like fact. In a case that has lived in public memory, repeated details can become polished from use, like stones in a pocket. The bicycle, the ice cream truck, the brief absence, the red shirt, the neighborhood, the sister going inside. All of these are true to the story's shape, but the investigator still asks how each detail was first recorded, by whom and under what circumstances. That is not coldness. It is care. Care in detective work can look like doubt, because careful people do not accept a thing merely because it has been said many times. They trace it back to its source, and then they ask whether the source was close to the event, whether it was written down promptly, whether another source supports it, and whether later retellings have added a shine that the original detail did not have. When a detective does that, they are not trying to take humanity out of the case. They are trying to give humanity a foundation strong enough to hold an answer if an answer ever comes. As the years lengthened, Mikelle's case became part of a larger landscape of missing children's cases from an era just before modern digital surveillance changed everyday life. The late 1990s were recent enough to feel familiar, but distant enough that many of today's investigative conveniences were absent. There were photographs, interviews, and records, but not the endless trail of daily digital traces that people now leave behind almost without noticing. A person could pass through a neighborhood without being recorded by 5 cameras, and a lead could depend almost entirely on whether a human being happened to look out at the right moment. That makes the witness work especially important, and also especially fragile. Memory is not a fixed photograph, and yet it is often all an investigator has. You might read a witness account and imagine the person standing at a kitchen sink, or stepping outside to bring in a child, or returning from an errand with grocery bags in hand. They were not watching a case unfold, not yet, and what they saw was filtered through the ordinary assumption that the evening would remain ordinary. Only afterward did every detail become a possible clue. Only afterward did people search their minds for what they might have missed. That afterward is where much of the sorrow lives, because people can be very hard on themselves when a case remains unsolved. A neighbor may wonder why they did not look longer, a passerby may wonder why they did not remember a license plate, and a family member may replay a simple decision with a weight no simple decision should have to carry. A compassionate investigation recognizes that weight and does not add to it carelessly. It asks what happened, but it does not pretend that ordinary people should have known the future before it arrived. For Kimber, the last ordinary image of her sister became something she has spoken about with care across the years, and that kind of memory belongs first to her, not to the public. An investigator can receive it, record it, and return to it, but must also understand that it is not merely a detail, it is a piece of a sister's life. The same is true for Mikelle's parents, who became part of the public face of the search while also living a private loss that no public attention could solve. Families in such cases often have to repeat the most painful facts because repetition keeps the missing person visible, and visibility can be a form of protection against being forgotten. That is another kind of patient detective work, though it is not always named that way. Families organize, speak, answer questions, correct errors, follow tips, and keep records, sometimes for decades, becoming steady keepers of a case while the world's attention moves in and out like weather. The official file and the family archive may not be the same, but both exist because someone refused to let the story vanish entirely. In the long life of a cold case, that refusal matters. At some point, the investigation becomes less about the first search and more about re-entry. Re-entry means coming back to the file after the initial urgency has passed, after the cameras have gone, after the neighborhood has settled into a new normal, and asking what can still be done. You might begin by making a fresh chronology, not copying the old one, but rebuilding it from primary notes. You place each known moment in order, marking the source beside it, and where the sources differ, you leave the difference visible, instead of smoothing it away. Then you might build a list of people associated with the neighborhood, people interviewed, people mentioned, people missed, people who moved, and people who appeared in later tips. Each name becomes a small doorway, and some doorways open onto nothing, but some lead to another room of the house. You might review property records, old maps, school calendars, weather records, and media timelines, not because each one is likely to solve the case alone, but because together they help restore the world in which the disappearance happened. Patient investigation often involves reconstructing context so carefully that a detail can finally be understood in its proper size. Context tells you what was common and what was unusual. It tells you which sounds belonged to the evening, which routes were natural, which houses had children outside, and which people might have had a reason to be passing through. Without context, every detail can appear equally important. With context, the picture may not become complete, but it becomes less chaotic. The investigators who worked Mikelle's case across the years had to carry the case through periods of motion and stillness. There were times when news attention returned, times when a lead required fresh follow-up, and times when the file waited in a quieter state, not closed, but not visibly moving. That waiting can be misunderstood. People may think nothing is happening because nothing is being announced. Yet many investigative steps cannot be shared, and many careful reviews produce only the modest result of knowing that one more possibility has been checked. In ordinary life, checking a possibility and finding nothing can feel like failure. In detective work, it can also be progress, because a file becomes stronger when uncertainty is reduced honestly, even if the reduction brings no public satisfaction. A lead that proves false is not the answer, but it can prevent future investigators from spending the same hours in the same unlit corridor. That too is part of the labor, leaving clear notes for the person who may one day return. You can imagine an old tip log with hundreds or thousands of entries, each one representing someone's belief, suspicion, memory, fear, or attempt to help. The detective reads through them, knowing that many were sincere, some were mistaken, a few may have been cruel, and one, perhaps, might still contain something that was not fully understood. The emotional discipline required for that work is considerable. You cannot become excited by every possibility, because excitement can make you careless. But you cannot become numb either, because numbness can make you miss the human signal inside the noise. So you move steadily. You make a note, place a call, request a record, compare a date, and return to the file. A case like Mikelle's also asks investigators to consider the role of geography beyond the neighborhood. Mesa is part of a larger metropolitan area, and a person can move from a residential street into a wider network of roads with unsettling ease. In the first hours, that larger map can feel overwhelming, because once a possibility leaves the immediate scene, it can travel in many directions. But investigators work by narrowing where they can, asking which routes made sense, which times allowed movement, which witnesses might have been positioned along the way, and which reports from nearby areas deserve comparison. Again, the work is not dramatic, but layered. A map is marked, then remarked, then compared with statements, then returned to storage, then taken out years later when a new lead suggests that one small area deserves another look. Cold case work is full of returning to a street, returning to a witness, returning to a photograph, returning to a box of evidence, returning to a question that has already been asked, because time may have changed the answer. That is why the phrase patient detective work matters here. Patience is not passive, not merely waiting for a confession or a lucky discovery, but an active willingness to keep doing careful things when no immediate reward appears. In Mikelle's case, patience meant continuing to treat the file as open. It meant preserving what could be preserved, listening when people called, re examining public leads, and allowing new detectives to bring fresh attention without pretending the past was simple. It also meant respecting the limits of what could be said publicly. Investigators may know more than they can share, or they may know less than people assume. And in either case, silence can be part of the work rather than a lack of it. For listeners, and for anyone thinking about the case from the outside, that silence can be difficult. We want to know which leads mattered, which names still matter, what evidence remains, and whether the answer is near or far. But an unresolved investigation often cannot offer that comfort. Instead, it offers a different kind of lesson, quieter and less complete. It shows how people keep faith with a question without turning it into spectacle. The Mikelle Biggs case is often remembered through one terrible narrowness, the short time between being seen and being gone. But investigating it was not narrow at all. It spread outward into streets, homes, interviews, media, records, theories, disappointments, and renewed reviews, becoming a long human effort arranged around a few fragile facts. If you sit with those facts long enough, the case begins to feel less like a puzzle and more like a room where people have been waiting respectfully for someone to speak. The room contains family members, detectives, neighbors, searchers, reporters, and strangers who heard the story once and never quite forgot it. No one in that room can force the answer to arrive. They can only keep the chairs arranged, keep the light on, keep the file from being misplaced, and keep asking in the careful ways that evidence allows. The evening on East El Moro Avenue remains at the center, soft with winter light and sharpened by what followed. You return to it again because every cold case detective returns to the last known place, not to dwell there helplessly, but to honor the fact that the truth, whatever it is, passed through that small piece of the world. You picture the child on the bicycle, the sister nearby, the sound somewhere in the neighborhood, and the ordinary confidence that home was only a few steps away. Then you let the image rest, because it belongs to the family first, and because the work requires tenderness as well as attention. When the first rush of searching becomes the long work of investigation, the pace changes, and people outside the case may not notice the change at first. The same name appears in reports, the same photograph appears on posters, the same question is asked on anniversaries. But inside the file, the work becomes deeper and quieter. Investigators may begin to sort tips by category, separating sightings from suspicions, vehicles from persons, local leads from distant ones, and urgent claims from claims that can be checked more slowly. A system begins to form because without a system, care becomes scattered, and scattered care can lose the very thing it hopes to find. There is a kind of mercy in organization. It says that every call will be given a place, every document will be stored, every lead will be traceable, and the next person who opens the file will not have to begin in confusion. In a long case, that matters more than people realize. The detective who starts the file may not be the detective who finishes it, and the note written clearly today may become the bridge someone needs years later. The file becomes a conversation across time. One investigator records what was done, another reads it after a retirement, a transfer, or a new assignment, and the case continues through the discipline of people who may never meet. Mikelle's case has moved through that kind of time. The child who vanished in 1999 would now belong to another age entirely, while the records still hold her at 11, fixed in the clothing and measurements needed to search for her. That fixedness is one of the deep peculiarities of missing person cases. The world ages, the family ages, the investigators age, and yet the public photograph remains young, asking everyone who sees it to imagine both the child who was and the adult who might have been. Age-progressed images try to cross that distance, and they are made with care, but they cannot solve the emotional problem completely. They offer a possible face for the future, while the family carries 1,000 private possibilities no software or sketch can fully know. For detectives, age progression is a tool, useful for visibility and recognition, especially when a case remains open long after childhood. But it is also a reminder that the investigation must hold two timelines at once: the timeline of the disappearance and the timeline of everything that has passed since. The disappearance timeline asks what happened on the 2nd of January. The long timeline asks who may have spoken, moved, changed, died, confessed to someone, saved an object, or carried a memory into later years. Both timelines matter. One looks at minutes, and the other looks at decades. The patient investigator learns to move between them without losing balance. Too much focus on the first minutes can trap the case in the original uncertainty, while too much focus on later speculation can loosen it from the facts that anchor it. So the work returns to balance, again and again, as steady as breathing. The early facts, the later leads, the public record, the private file, the family's memory, and the evidence still capable of being examined, all of it has to be held without letting any single piece pretend to be the whole. This is what it was like, in one sense, to investigate Mikelle Biggs's case. It was to stand in the space between a very brief disappearance and a very long search, knowing that the first was measured in minutes, while the second has been measured in years. It was to understand that the case's most repeated phrase, the idea that she was gone in around 90 seconds, describes only one part of the experience. The investigative life of the case has not been brief at all, and the people who stayed with it have lived in the opposite of that phrase, in long hours, long years, long silences, and long returns. There is a quiet truth there, and it is worth staying with for a moment. Some cases become known because of the speed of the event, but they are investigated through slowness. The slowness is not failure. It is the form care takes when certainty does not come quickly. And so the file remains, not as a relic, but as a place where careful work can still happen. The questions are old now, but old questions can still be honest, and sometimes honesty is what keeps them alive long enough for an answer to find them. They are old in the way a handwritten note becomes old, not because it has stopped mattering, but because many hands have unfolded it, read it, and placed it carefully back where it belongs. In a cold case office, the age of a file can be felt before a person even reads the first page, because the materials themselves carry the years. There may be copied reports with faint edges, old photographs with slight fading, envelopes that have been opened and resealed, and the familiar smell of paper that has waited in cabinets through summers, winters, and the quiet reorganizing of departments. You sit with all of it under a steady lamp, and you let the file become a place rather than a stack of documents, because somewhere inside that place is the beginning of the next question. The investigator coming to Mikelle's case after many years would need to move with two kinds of attention at once. One kind belongs to the original disappearance, the ordinary street, the bicycle, the sister, the neighborhood, and the first widening circle of searches. The other kind belongs to time itself, to the way facts were preserved, the way memories shifted, the way new technologies arrived, and the way people who once seemed unreachable may later be found through records that did not exist, or were not easily searched when the case began. That second kind of attention can be very quiet, because it often begins not with a knock at a door, but with a spreadsheet, a legal pad, or a clean timeline made from old entries. You take the first report, then the second, then the supplemental notes, and you copy each relevant time, statement, name, address, vehicle, and uncertainty into a new structure, not changing the past, only arranging it so the past can be examined with care. It is slow work, and it asks the investigator to be humble enough to notice what earlier minds may have missed only because they were standing too close to the first emergency. There is a particular tenderness in reading early reports from a case involving a child, because the language is necessarily practical, while the meaning underneath is enormous. A line may say that a bicycle was located, or that a witness was contacted, or that a search area was expanded, and yet each sentence represents someone's worry becoming action. The documents do not weep, and they do not plead, but they carry the evidence of people moving quickly in the hope that quickness would be enough. As the case settled into its longer form, quickness gave way to endurance, and endurance became its own kind of skill. Detectives had to know when to push, when to wait, when to revisit, and when to hold a lead in reserve until another piece of information made it useful. They had to learn the emotional weather of a case that did not close, because every anniversary brought public memory back to the surface, and every new lead carried the old question into the room again. In the early days, The neighborhood itself would have been searched as both a physical space and a social space. The physical space was made of streets, yards, alleys, walls, sidewalks, and sightlines. But the social space was made of who knew who belonged, who visited, who watched children play, and who might have been noticed only if someone had thought to notice. Good investigators move through both spaces because a street is never only pavement and addresses. It is also routine, trust, habit, and recognition. You may imagine the canvas expanding house by house, with officers asking careful questions at one door, then another, while the daylight faded and people tried to remember what had seemed unimportant only an hour earlier. Did you hear music? Did you see the girls? Did a vehicle pass? Did anyone stop? Did a dog bark? Did anyone come to the door? Did anything feel unusual in that way ordinary people can sometimes sense before they can explain? These questions were not dramatic, and many answers must have been uncertain, but uncertainty itself has to be recorded when a child is missing. Later, when cold case detectives review those first interviews, they listen for the grain of memory. A statement made close in time may have freshness, but it may also contain confusion, shock, or the pressure of a hurried evening. A statement made years later may be less exact in sequence, yet sometimes it contains a detail that the person held quietly for a long time, a detail that never fit anywhere until the right investigator asked the right question in the right way. That is why the tone of a re-interview matters. The detective cannot arrive like an accusation, because most people being recontacted are simply witnesses to a sorrow they did not choose. They may have been neighbors, classmates, parents of friends, drivers passing through, or children themselves when Mikelle disappeared, and by the time someone calls again, they may have carried their own memories of that day into middle age. A careful re-interview begins with permission, even when the law does not strictly require it, because memory opens more fully when a person feels respected. The detective might say they are reviewing the case, that they know it has been many years and that even small details can matter, while leaving room for the witness to say they remember little, or nothing, or only one image. The silence after that invitation can be important, because sometimes a person needs to feel the years pass through them before the memory becomes speakable. You ask them to begin wherever they naturally begin, because the order in which a memory surfaces can be its own kind of information. Someone might begin with the weather, or with the sound of the truck, or with the feeling of their parent calling them inside, or with a television report later that night that made the neighborhood feel suddenly changed. You do not interrupt too quickly, because even a wandering recollection can carry a small true thing inside it, and your job is to notice without steering too hard. Then, gently, you return to the essentials. Where were you? What could you see? What could you hear? Who was with you? What direction were you facing? And did you speak to anyone afterward about what you remembered? These questions sound simple, but when they are asked many years later, each one has to cross a distance made of ordinary life, and the detective must listen for the difference between memory, inference, and something learned later from the news. That difference can matter very much in a case like Mikelle's, because public retellings can settle into people's minds until they feel like personal recollection. A witness may sincerely believe they remember a detail, when in fact they remember hearing it repeated, and this is not dishonesty so much as the natural blending of memory with community story. Patient investigators make room for that by asking where the detail came from, when it was first remembered, and whether anyone else heard it before it became part of the public account. In an old investigation, the detective is not only seeking new information, but also cleaning the edges of old information. That cleaning is delicate work, because one must never scrub so hard that the original texture disappears. You preserve what a witness said then, you record what they say now, and you allow the difference to remain visible, because the difference may later tell another investigator something useful about timing, influence, or confidence. There are also the records that seem plain until someone asks a better question. A call log may show when a tip came in, but not why it was prioritized, while a supplemental report may mention a follow-up that was completed without showing the reasoning behind it. The detective reading years later has to infer carefully, and where inference becomes too thin, they must mark it as inference and not mistake it for fact. This kind of restraint is one of the least visible forms of professionalism. It is tempting, especially in an emotionally heavy case, to make the old file more complete than it is by smoothing gaps and linking fragments with confident language. But the file deserves honesty, and Mikelle deserves honesty, because a true answer cannot be built from wishful connections, no matter how deeply people want an end to the waiting. The waiting itself became a presence around the case, not only for the family, but for investigators who may have moved on to other assignments while still remembering the name. Some cases follow officers through their careers, appearing in quiet thoughts during unrelated work, or returning on an anniversary when a reporter calls, or when a new technology makes a supervisor ask whether old evidence can be reviewed. A detective may retire, yet still read a headline about the case and feel the old pull of unfinished duty. The public sometimes imagines detectives as people who leave a case behind when their shift ends, but unresolved cases often live differently in the mind. They become questions one cannot answer at dinner, or while driving past a familiar street, or while seeing a child the same age as the missing child was when the file began. This does not mean every detective carries every case with the same weight, but some names become attached to a person's sense of what work remains undone. For the Biggs family, the case was not a professional obligation, but a permanent part of daily life, and that difference must be honored. Investigators could step away for a weekend, even if the case remained with them, but the family lived inside the absence in ways no report can measure. Their hope for answers was not a theory to be tested, but a need woven through birthdays, holidays, school years, moves, conversations, and the long quiet hours when nothing new came. When a family remains publicly involved, investigators also have to manage communication carefully. Too much silence can feel like abandonment, while too much detail can endanger the integrity of the case or offer hope before the evidence deserves it. The best communication in such cases is often measured, respectful, and steady, a way of saying that the file is not forgotten even when there is no update bright enough to announce. There is compassion in telling a family the truth, even when the truth is simply that a lead has been checked and did not produce an answer. That sentence can be painful, because it closes a small door, but it can also prevent a person from waiting beside a door that no longer opens. In cold case work, mercy is sometimes found not in promising, but in refusing to let uncertainty become more ornate than it is. The passage of time can make people outside the case impatient for a single theory, and it can make speculation appear almost helpful, as though naming a possibility loudly enough might bring it into focus. But investigators must be slower than speculation, because a theory can travel freely while evidence has to walk. Evidence must be gathered, preserved, compared, challenged, and sometimes carried into court, where every weakness becomes visible. That standard shapes the investigation even when no arrest is near. A detective reviewing Mikelle's case has to think not only about what seems possible, but about what could be proven, and whether a lead can survive the long journey from suspicion to accountability. That journey is demanding for good reason, because the law must protect both the person who was harmed and the people who might be wrongly accused in the effort to answer for that harm. This is why publicly discussed persons of interest occupy such a difficult space. Their names may be known, their connections may be examined, and their behavior may seem suspicious to some observers, yet the difference between suspicion and proof remains essential. The patient investigator does not ignore suspicion, but neither do they let it become a shortcut around the hard work of corroboration. Corroboration is a plain word, but it carries much of the weight of detective work. It asks whether one statement is supported by another, whether a memory is supported by a record, whether a location is supported by time, and whether an apparent pattern remains a pattern when every piece is checked. Without corroboration, a case may feel emotionally convincing while remaining legally fragile, and fragility can fail the very people who need the truth most. In Mikelle's case, the shortness of the known window made corroboration especially important. If someone claimed knowledge, investigators had to ask how they would know, where they were, what they saw, what records supported them, and whether their statement contained information not already public. A person can insert themselves into a famous case for many reasons, some confused, some self-serving, some sincerely mistaken, and each possibility has to be considered without losing the thread. That is one reason police are often careful about what details they release. Holding back a piece of information can help distinguish a true witness from someone repeating a story heard elsewhere, and in an unresolved case, such holdback details can remain valuable for many years. The public may experience that caution as secrecy, but sometimes it is simply stewardship, the protection of whatever small tools the file still has. Stewardship is a good word for cold case investigation. It suggests that the detective does not own the case, but tends it, keeping it intact for the moment when evidence, memory, or technology may finally align. The work is not glamorous, and it may never be rewarded publicly, yet it preserves the possibility that the future can do something the past could not. Technology has changed greatly since 1999, and every change invites the same careful question. Is there anything in this file that can now be tested, searched, enhanced, compared, or shared in a way that was not possible before? The answer is not always yes, and even when it is yes, the result may not be decisive. But a cold case detective must keep asking, because the tools of one era should not be allowed to limit the efforts of the next. Some cold cases turn on DNA, others on digital databases, others on genealogical research, financial records, vehicle histories, or the rediscovery of a witness who had never understood the importance of what they knew. Mikelle's case remains unresolved in the public record, so no method can be named as the key, but the broader lesson still surrounds it. Old cases endure partly because investigators continue to ask whether a new method can illuminate an old uncertainty, without forcing the answer to appear before it is ready. There is also value in simple digitization, the quiet conversion of paper into searchable form. A name that appears once in a handwritten report may not seem important until it appears again in another file, another jurisdiction, or another tip many years later. When records become searchable, patterns can emerge not through brilliance, but through patience multiplied by access. Yet even digitized records need human judgment. A database can find the matching words, but a detective must decide whether the match means anything, whether the people are the same, whether the dates align, and whether the connection is more than coincidence. Machines can speed the search, but they cannot replace the calm ethical work of deciding what is fair, what is meaningful, and what is merely noise. The old neighborhood canvas, if converted into a modern format, might allow investigators to see clusters and gaps more clearly. Which homes were contacted, which residents moved before follow-up, which vehicles were reported, which streets produced no statements, and which areas might deserve fresh attention because an assumption made in the first days now seems too narrow. This is not reopening the case in the theatrical sense, but reopening the map with better light. Maps matter in a case like this because the event was tied so closely to place. East El Moro Avenue was not only a location printed in reports, but the last known environment around Mikelle, a small portion of Mesa that had its own layout, rhythms, and lines of sight. To examine the place carefully is not to intrude on it, but to acknowledge that the truth, whatever its shape, had to move through real space. An investigator might compare old aerial photographs with modern ones, looking at changes in walls, lots, roads, and nearby businesses. They might consider whether an address that now appears ordinary had a different use then, whether a route that now seems unlikely was easier at the time, or whether construction, traffic, or neighborhood patterns made certain movements more visible or less visible. Such work is quiet enough that it may never be mentioned publicly, but it can steady the investigation by making the scene less imagined and more known. The same is true of weather and light. The 2nd of January would have brought winter timing to Mesa, with evening arriving early and shadows lengthening before many families were ready to call the day finished. Light affects memory, visibility, and confidence, and while it does not solve a case by itself, it helps investigators understand what a witness could reasonably have seen from a doorway, window, sidewalk, or passing car. You learn, in patient investigation, to respect conditions. A person standing under a porch light may see differently from a person looking through glass. A driver may notice movement without details, and a child may remember sound more vividly than distance. The more clearly you understand the conditions, the more fairly you can interpret the statements people gave. That fairness is not only practical but humane. It prevents investigators from demanding impossible precision from ordinary witnesses who were living ordinary lives until the evening changed. It allows for partial memory, for uncertainty, for the fact that a person can be truthful and still be incomplete. In the Biggs case, the child witness at the center of the early timeline deserves that same fairness. Kimber's recollection has been essential to public understanding, but it came from a younger sister who was herself living through a sudden and frightening absence. To treat her memory responsibly is to take it seriously while also recognizing the tenderness of its origin. A detective reading her account years later would not see it as merely a statement, but as a moment in a child's life that became fixed by circumstance. The work would require attention to what she said, when she said it, and how the information was recorded. But it would also require restraint, because a witness who was a child should not be made to carry more certainty than memory can honestly hold. This is one of the gentler truths that careful cold case work teaches. People can help an investigation without being able to complete it, and a witness can offer something vital without being able to answer every question that follows. When the known facts do not complete the picture, investigators sometimes turn again to behavioral possibilities, not to dramatize, but to widen or narrow practical paths. Was the person responsible likely familiar with the area, comfortable enough to act quickly, or opportunistic in a way that depended on the moment? These questions must remain questions until evidence supports them, but they can guide the review of names, vehicles, routes, and prior reports. The risk, always, is that a profile can become a story, and a story can become a cage. A profile may suggest tendencies, but real people behave unevenly, and an investigator who leans too hard on a template may overlook someone who does not fit it neatly. The better use of such thinking is modest, a lantern rather than a map, helping illuminate possibilities without pretending to define the road. Modesty is a valuable investigative virtue. It keeps the file open to correction, keeps theories from hardening too soon, and keeps the investigator aware that the person who knows the key fact may not look important at first glance. In old cases, breakthroughs sometimes come from the side, through a person who knew a person, who remembered a remark, who kept a clipping, or who once dismissed a detail as too small to matter. A small detail can survive in unusual ways. It can live in a diary, a family story, a rumor someone did not trust, a photograph in the background, a vehicle remembered by color rather than make, or an old address book tucked inside a drawer. The detective cannot search every drawer in the world, of course, but the public memory of a case can encourage people to look again at what they have carried. That is why anniversaries, though painful, can have investigative value. They return Mikelle's name to the community not as spectacle, but as an invitation for memory to stir. Someone who was a teenager then may now be a parent. Someone who feared speaking then may now feel safer, and someone who never understood the importance of a detail may finally connect it to the larger picture. The best anniversary coverage is careful, factual, and compassionate. It does not turn the case into entertainment, and it does not pretend that sorrow is more meaningful when amplified. It simply places the child's name, photograph, and known facts before the public again, allowing the possibility that one person somewhere may recognize the missing piece they have held. Mikelle's family has lived through many such anniversaries, each one marking both the passage of time and the stubborn continuation of hope. Hope in this setting is not bright in a simple way, because it has had to share space with disappointment for many years. It is quieter than the hope of the first night, more weathered, and perhaps more disciplined, but it remains a force that keeps the question from fading completely. Investigators must respect that hope without using it carelessly. They cannot feed it with hints they cannot support, and they cannot dismiss it as naive simply because the years have been long. Hope is part of why cold cases are reviewed, why tips are checked, why old evidence is preserved, and why a file can remain morally alive even when the public has turned elsewhere. In the quiet study of this case, you begin to understand that investigation is not only a search for a person responsible, but also a search for right relationship with the unknown. The unknown can make people frantic, bitter, speculative, or numb. And the work of a thoughtful investigator is to remain steady enough that the unknown does not distort the search. That steadiness is difficult, but it is also a form of respect, A detective may open the file on a Monday morning and find no new lead at all. They may spend hours clarifying an old address, only to learn that the person died years earlier, or that the record belonged to someone else with the same name. They may request archived material and wait weeks for a response that adds only a minor correction, yet the correction still matters because the file is now a little cleaner than before. This is the unglamorous accumulation by which cold cases survive. Not every step brings the answer closer in a visible way, but each honest step reduces confusion, preserves memory, or prevents future error. The work resembles restoration more than pursuit, as though the detective is cleaning an old painting one careful inch at a time, hoping the original image can be seen more clearly beneath the varnish of years. Sometimes, in that restoration, a person notices that a long accepted detail rests on a weak source. That can be unsettling, because the story people know may need to be adjusted, and public memory does not always welcome adjustment. But if the correction is true, it belongs in the file, because loyalty to Mikelle requires loyalty to the facts, even when the facts are less tidy than the story. At other times, the review may strengthen what people have long believed. A detail repeated for years may trace back to a solid original statement supported by multiple sources, and the investigator can mark it with greater confidence. That, too, is progress, because knowing what is firm allows the uncertain parts to stand out more clearly. The work moves between these two outcomes, confirming and correcting, until the file becomes more honest in its arrangement. It may still not solve the case, but it becomes a better vessel for the truth, should the truth ever arrive. There is a quiet dignity in that. A case does not have to be solved today for today's work to matter. In Mikelle's case, the dignity also belongs to the community members who searched, spoke, called, and remembered. Communities are imperfect in every direction, capable of rumor and error, but also capable of extraordinary persistence when a child is missing. The people who walked streets, handed out flyers, or gave interviews were participating in the only form of care available to them at the time. Some of those people may still remember exactly where they were when they first heard. Others may remember only the feeling, the way a neighborhood's confidence changed, the way parents called children in earlier, the way an ordinary ice cream truck sound could no longer remain purely ordinary. These emotional memories are not evidence in the narrow sense, but they are part of the case's human landscape. A cold case investigator has to live partly in that landscape while remaining disciplined. They must feel enough to care, but not so much that feeling replaces proof. They must understand the family's pain, but not let the need to ease it produce premature certainty. This balance can be lonely. The public may want declarations, the family may want movement, supervisors may want results, and the detective may privately want all of those things too, while the evidence offers only another slow path. Still, the investigator returns to method, because method is what remains when emotion cannot carry the case any farther. Method asks what was done, what was not done, what can still be done, and what should not be repeated because it has already been checked thoroughly. Method asks whether evidence was preserved, whether interviews were recorded, whether leads were documented, whether databases have been updated, and whether other agencies should be consulted. Method is not coldness, but a structure strong enough to hold compassion without collapsing into wishful thinking. In the quiet room where the file rests, you can almost feel the rhythm of that method. Read, note, compare, verify, call, wait, revise, and read again. Each word is simple, but the sequence can stretch across years, and inside that stretch, a case remains possible. Possibility is not the same as promise. It is gentler than that, and more honest. The possibility in Mikelle's case rests partly on the fact that people still know her name, still share her case, still respond when law enforcement asks for information, and still understand that an old memory may have value. It rests also on the persistence of records, because even when people forget, a report may remain, a photograph may remain, an evidence log may remain, and a small preserved fact may wait for its proper context. A detective returning to the evidence would have to think carefully about what can and cannot be revisited. Some items may have been tested, some may not be suitable for testing. Some may have been handled under standards different from today's. and some may contain nothing useful at all. The responsible approach is neither despairing nor magical, but practical, asking what is possible under current methods and what expectations should remain modest. This practical humility is essential when discussing old evidence. It would be comforting to say every cold case holds a hidden laboratory answer, but many do not, and even promising evidence can fail to produce usable results. Yet testing, reviewing, and preserving remain worthwhile because one cannot know in advance which quiet item may one day speak with unexpected clarity. The same humility applies to witness leads. A person who comes forward after years may be important, or may be mistaken, or may offer information that is true but not central. The investigator receives the statement, checks it against the file, asks what can be corroborated, and leaves room for the possibility that even a partial truth may later connect with another partial truth. Cold cases often advance through partial truths. One person knows a date, another remembers a car, another recalls a remark, another provides an old address, and none of them alone can carry the burden of an answer. But together, if they are real and properly connected, they may begin to form a path that was not visible from any single point. The difficulty is knowing which pieces belong together. Too eager a hand can force a pattern, while too cautious a hand can leave meaningful pieces scattered. This is why experience matters, not the dramatic experience of instinctive certainty, but the quieter experience of having seen how often truth arrives irregularly and how often coincidence dresses itself in convincing clothes. An experienced detective may feel a pull toward a lead and still refuse to name it more than a lead. They may tell the family that the information is being reviewed, not that it will solve the case. They may spend weeks on it and then set it aside with sadness, because sadness is allowed, but false certainty is not. In that way, the investigation becomes an ethical practice. Every decision asks how to serve the missing child, the family, the community, and the truth, without sacrificing one to the convenience of another. It is slow because it has to be slow, and careful because anything less would be another kind of harm. The public record of Mikelle's disappearance remains spare in places, and spareness can be hard for people who want to understand. We know the broad outline, the child outside, the sister going in, the bicycle left behind, the search that followed, and the decades without a confirmed public answer. Around those known points are many private records, investigative judgments, and pieces of information that belong to law enforcement and family memory more than to public retelling. A calm narration should not pretend to possess what it does not possess. It can describe the kind of work such a case requires, the known facts that have been shared, and the human meaning of an investigation extended across years. It can sit with the mystery without trying to make the darkness brighter by inventing shapes inside it. That is perhaps one of the most respectful ways to approach Mikelle's case. Not to embellish it, not to sharpen it for drama, but to understand how much effort can gather around a single unresolved evening. A child disappeared from a street where she should have remained within reach, and because of that, many people spent many years asking what the street, the witnesses, the records, and time itself might still reveal. You may imagine the investigator now, not in the first frantic hours, but decades later, sitting at a desk where modern screens glow beside old paper. On the screen, there are databases, maps, indexes, and archived news, while on the desk, there are reports written when the case was still new. The detective moves between them, bridging errors with a quiet concentration that feels almost like translation. A name from an old report is typed into a modern system, an address is checked against property records. A vehicle description, if one exists in the file, is compared with registration possibilities from that time, though such records may be incomplete or unavailable after so many years. Each task may produce little, but each task is a way of refusing to let the file remain frozen in the limitations of 1999. Then comes the human follow-up. A person connected to an old address may be found in another state, and the detective prepares for a call that will begin gently. The person may answer with surprise, may remember the case at once, may need time, or may say they were too young to know anything. And whatever the response, the detective records it in the long conversation the file has been having with time. There is something almost reverent about adding a new note to an old case file. The note may be ordinary, only a few sentences saying a person was contacted and provided no additional information, yet it proves the case is still being tended. It tells the next investigator that this path was walked again, not carelessly, but with purpose. Sometimes the act of tending is all that can be done. That can be difficult to accept, especially when the case involves a child whose absence has never been explained. But tending is not nothing, because in the world of cold cases, neglect is one of the few things that can truly close a door. As long as the file is tended, a future remains open. Not a guaranteed future, not a future promised by comforting words, but a practical future in which a new lead, a new method, or a newly willing witness can be received properly. The work today prepares the case to be ready for tomorrow, and readiness can matter more than anyone sees at the time. Mikelle's name has remained in missing person databases, news archives, family appeals, and the memory of Mesa, and each of those places keeps a different kind of watch. A database preserves searchable facts. An archive preserves public history. A family appeal preserves love. A community memory preserves the sense that what happened on that winter evening still belongs to everyone's conscience. The detective's watch is different again. It is the watch of procedure, doubt, comparison, and return. But beneath those practical habits is the same human hope that an answer, if it exists, can still be reached. The hope is quiet, because it has learned caution, but it is hope all the same. And so the investigation continues in the only way it honestly can, through careful review, through responsible attention, through the willingness to hear from someone who has never spoken, and through the refusal to mistake silence for an ending. The street remains part of the story, the bicycle remains part of the story, the sound that drew the children outside remains part of the story, and the empty space between known moments remains the place where the questions gather. When you sit with the file long enough, you may begin to notice that the unknown is not a single blank, but a series of smaller blanks. Who passed by? Who looked out? Who remembered? Who withheld? Who misunderstood? Who saw something ordinary that was not ordinary after all? Each blank asks for patience rather than panic, and each one may or may not ever be filled. The investigator does not get to choose which blank will matter. They can only prepare the file so that if an answer comes to one of them, the answer can be recognized. That preparation is slow, and it is quiet, and it is one of the most honest forms of devotion a cold case can receive. In the late hours of review, the mind sometimes returns to the simplest fact. Mikelle was a child waiting for an ice cream truck close to home in the fading light of an Arizona winter evening. Everything that followed, the searches, interviews, tips, theories, anniversaries, and renewed reviews, began from that small and ordinary moment, which is why the ordinary moment must be held with such unusual care. Care does not solve a case by itself, but without care, a case can lose its shape. So the file stays open, and the questions stay arranged, and the people who remember continue to remember. Somewhere, in a box, a report may still wait for a reader who sees it differently. Somewhere, in a person's memory, an old detail may still be resting beneath the surface, not forgotten exactly, only uncalled until the right question reaches it. And the work, patient and imperfect and deeply human, goes on in that quiet space between what is known and what may yet be known. It goes on without the satisfaction of a clean line drawn beneath the page, because some investigations do not end where the mind wants them to end. They continue as a series of small returns to the map, to the names, to the first hour, to the second hour, to the questions that have been asked so many times, they almost seem worn smooth. Yet a careful investigator knows that worn things can still hold texture under the right light, and that a detail repeated for years may still have another edge, another source, another meaning waiting beneath the familiar wording. You might begin one morning with the map again, not because the map has changed, but because your questions have. The first investigators needed to know where Mikelle might be found, while a later investigator may need to understand how quickly someone could leave, how slowly someone could pass, and who might have seen the movement without recognizing its importance. The same streets answer different questions at different times, and that is why the map remains alive inside the file. A residential map can look simple until you ask it to carry the weight of a disappearance. Then the corners matter, the distances matter, the sight lines from windows matter, and even the places where a parked vehicle might briefly belong begin to feel important. You do not make these details dramatic because they are not dramatic in themselves, but you let them become precise, and precision is one of the ways an old investigation steadies itself. In the earliest hours, officers would have thought in practical rings: first the house, then the street, then the nearby blocks, and then the wider city beyond the first search. That pattern is familiar in missing child work because the mind must begin with what is closest, even while fearing that the answer may already be farther away. It is a difficult balance to search near with urgency and search outward with discipline, while every minute passing feels as though it has weight. Years later, when there is no longer a first-hour urgency, the same rings can be studied differently. Which ring was covered by whom, at what time, under what conditions, with what notes, and with what assumptions guiding the search. The detective is no longer running through the circles but drawing them again, comparing them to records, and asking whether any space between them was left less examined than people believed. This is not second-guessing in the careless sense. It is more like proofreading a letter written under pressure, knowing the writer did the best they could, and still knowing that pressure sometimes leaves a missed word. The first responders were working inside an emergency, while the cold case investigator has the strange privilege and burden of time, and time can reveal both errors and strengths with equal quietness. A search grid can have gaps for understandable reasons. A witness may not have been home, a gate may have been locked, a lead may have pulled attention elsewhere, or an area may have seemed less relevant because of what investigators believed in that moment. When a later detective finds such a gap, the goal is not blame, but understanding, because understanding is the only useful way to decide whether the gap can still be addressed. Some gaps cannot be repaired. A vacant lot may be built over, a witness may have died, a memory may have faded, or a record may have been lost during an office move years earlier. Cold casework requires the acceptance of such losses without surrendering to them, because some doors close while others remain merely hidden. That is why a detective keeps an inventory of what is gone and what remains. The gone things are named honestly, and the remaining things are protected carefully, because the future can only work with what has survived. A case file in that sense is partly an ark, carrying fragments across years in the hope that they may still find land. In the Mikelle Biggs case, the surviving public facts are few enough that each one has been held and examined many times. The bicycle, the clothing, the ice cream truck sound, the sister's account, the time of day, the street, and the absence of a public resolution form a small constellation. To investigate such a case is to move between those stars patiently, measuring the spaces between them without pretending the darkness is empty. The bicycle is one of those objects that seems simple until you sit with it. A child's bicycle is usually a sign of movement, play, ordinary freedom, and the practical confidence that home is near. When it is found without the child, it becomes a marker not only of where she had been, but of where the known story stops. An investigator looking at that detail would ask the plain questions first. Where exactly was it found? Who found it? How was it positioned? What condition was it in? Who handled it? What photographs were taken? And how quickly was it secured? These questions do not change the sorrow of the object, but they give the sorrow a structure, because evidence has to be treated as evidence even when it is emotionally difficult. The position of a bicycle may or may not tell much, depending on what was recorded and preserved. It might suggest a sudden interruption, or it might suggest nothing more than a child setting it down while waiting, and a responsible investigator must leave both possibilities open unless the facts decide between them. The important thing is that the object marked a last known point, and last known points have a quiet gravity around them. From that point, the case moved outward into possibilities. A person on foot, a person in a vehicle, someone familiar, someone passing through, someone who acted with planning, someone who acted because the moment appeared. Each possibility has different implications, and each must be measured against the narrowness of the window and the ordinary visibility of a neighborhood at dusk. A very brief window can mislead the imagination. It can make an event seem impossible, and then, in the mind's attempt to solve that impossibility, it can make theories become too elaborate. But investigators know that brief windows often contain more than they seem, because everyday movement is fast, attention is imperfect, and a familiar street can briefly fail to observe itself. At the same time, the briefness cannot be ignored. It suggests that whoever was involved, if someone was involved nearby, may have moved decisively or may have benefited from familiarity, chance, or a lack of witnesses at the exact moment that mattered. These are careful words, not conclusions, because in an unresolved case, the language has to leave room for the unknown to remain unknown. The ice cream truck detail asks for a different kind of patience. It is easy to see it as the central mechanism, the reason the children were outside, and perhaps the sound that shaped their attention. Yet investigators would also have to ask whether the music's presence was as direct as memory suggests, whether the truck was confirmed, whether it came from the expected direction, and whether it was relevant beyond its role in drawing children toward the street. Sound can be a strange witness. It travels around corners, changes with wind and walls, blends with memory, and can seem closer or farther than it truly was. In a neighborhood, music from an ice cream truck can create expectation even before the truck is visible, and children may respond to the promise of arrival rather than to the presence of the vehicle itself. That distinction matters because investigators cannot assume the sound and the disappearance are connected in only one way. The sound may have created the circumstances, or it may have been only part of the ordinary background, while another person, another vehicle, or another movement became important in the same small span. Patient investigation keeps the sound in the room without allowing it to become the whole room. A later detective might try to locate records or recollections of routes, vendors, or neighborhood patterns from that winter. They might ask whether the truck had been identified, whether its driver was interviewed, whether other residents saw it, and whether any children purchased anything nearby around the time Mikelle vanished. Much of that work would depend on old records and fading memory. Yet even negative answers could clarify what the file truly knows. In many old cases, the public remembers a detail as though it were a conclusion, when investigators may have regarded it as one line of inquiry among many. The ice cream truck may feel, in storytelling, like a symbol of childhood interrupted. But in a police file, it would also have to be a route, a driver, a timeline, and a set of possible witnesses. The difference between symbol and evidence is one of the quiet lessons this case offers. The clothing description carries another form of practical sorrow. A red shirt with a white stripe, blue jeans with designs, and the physical details needed for identification became part of how people searched for Mikelle. These descriptions are plain because they must be plain, yet they also remind you that a missing child's life becomes translated into the language strangers can use to look. Investigators repeat such details so that recognition can happen. A clerk, a driver, a neighbor, or someone watching a news segment may notice a shirt, a face, a child, or something that feels familiar. Repetition is not meant to reduce the person, but to create a bridge between a family's intimate knowledge and the public's ability to help. Over time, those details can become almost ceremonial, spoken on anniversaries, and printed on case pages, preserving the last confirmed image. The ceremony is not official, perhaps, but it has a quiet social function, because saying the details again says that the child at the center of them has not been allowed to vanish from memory. In that sense, the case file and the public appeal perform a similar act, keeping a place open. The cold case investigator knows that public attention can both clarify and blur. A renewed article may bring one useful tip, while also bringing many speculations built from partial information. The investigator receives the whole wave, separates what can be checked from what cannot, and keeps going, because attention is only useful when it is turned back into work. Turning attention into work requires systems. A tip comes in, it is logged, categorized, assigned, checked against known facts, and either developed or closed with a reason. The process sounds administrative, and it is, but administration is what keeps human concern from becoming a storm that tears the file apart. In an emotionally known case, people sometimes call with dreams, intuitions, old rumors, or memories softened by time. Some callers may be sincere but mistaken, and some may be trying to help by offering things that cannot be verified. A compassionate investigator does not mock the impulse to help, yet the file can only move on what can be tested. That boundary can be hard to maintain because the need for answers is so strong. When a case remains open for decades, almost any possibility can seem better than silence. But an investigator must protect the case from possibilities that cannot carry weight. To do otherwise would be to burden the family and the file with noise dressed as hope. There is another form of patience in deciding not to act publicly. Detectives may follow a lead quietly for weeks or months and say nothing, because speaking too soon could damage the lead, distress innocent people, or create expectations that the evidence later cannot support. The public sees quiet, but the quiet may contain activity, caution, and the deliberate choice not to confuse movement with announcement. This restraint can be especially difficult when a case has a long public life. People want to know that something is happening, and families deserve communication. Yet the integrity of the work sometimes depends on keeping the circle small. The detective has to live inside that tension, reporting appropriately while resisting the pressure to turn every step into a signpost. In the long investigation of Mikelle's disappearance, the role of media was therefore both necessary and complicated. News coverage helped spread her name, preserved public memory, and allowed the family's appeals to reach people far beyond Mesa. But media also compresses, because time is short, articles are brief, and a case that fills many boxes may be reduced to a few repeating phrases. Those repeating phrases can help people remember, but they can also make the case seem simpler than it is. The child, the bicycle, the ice cream truck, the 90 seconds, each phrase is useful, and each phrase is incomplete. A careful listener, like a careful investigator, lets the phrases guide the beginning of attention, but does not stop there. Behind every phrase is a set of questions. Behind the bicycle is the scene. Behind the truck is the route. Behind the brief time is the reliability and meaning of the timeline. Behind the disappearance is a family, a neighborhood, and an investigative effort that cannot be fully held in any single retelling. To investigate such a case is to keep opening the phrase until the work inside it can be seen. It is to remember that the public shorthand may be true, yet still too small. The shorthand is a doorway, not the house. The house, if we may keep that quiet image for a moment, contains many rooms. One room holds the first search, one holds the witness accounts, one holds public tips, one holds persons examined and not charged, one holds family appeals, one holds forensic possibilities, and one holds all the unanswered questions that do not yet belong anywhere else. The investigator moves from room to room with a notebook, never pretending that walking through the house is the same as reaching its center. Some rooms are entered often. Others wait years before anyone has reason to return. A single new record can change the order of the visit, and suddenly a room that seemed empty may need to be measured again. This is how old cases sometimes shift, not with a burst of drama, but with a small practical rearrangement. A person once thought unreachable is located. An old address connects to another name. A record confirms that someone was in town, or a new examination of evidence removes one possibility and strengthens another. None of these things may be enough alone, but they change the room's proportions. In Mikelle's case, the public does not know the full private history of such shifts, and that is appropriate. Unresolved investigations cannot be fully open books, yet we can understand the kind of patient work that would be required, because every missing child case of long duration asks its investigators to become guardians of detail. Guardianship involves saying no to carelessness. It means not repeating a claim merely because it is common online, not naming certainty where law enforcement has not established it, and not allowing the child's story to become a vessel for other people's appetite for mystery. The case is a human matter first, and the mystery only after that. That distinction shapes the tone of every responsible retelling. Mikelle's disappearance can be discussed with seriousness and depth without turning it into a spectacle. The emotional center is not shock, but endurance. The endurance of her family, the endurance of investigators, and the endurance of a question that has remained unanswered far longer than anyone in 1999 could have imagined. Endurance is not always noble in the way people like to imagine. Sometimes it is simply waking up and finding the same absence still there, then making breakfast, going to work, answering a phone call, and doing what the day requires. Families endure because there is no alternative, and investigators endure because the work has not released them. The community's endurance is different, less constant perhaps, but still real. It appears when someone shares an anniversary notice, when a former neighbor thinks back to that winter evening, when a person who has moved away still recognizes Mikelle's name, or when a cold case detective asks the public again for information. Community memory flickers, but it can be rekindled, and sometimes a flicker is enough to show where an old path begins. A detective might spend time thinking about who would have been a child then and an adult now. Children in the neighborhood may have seen things they did not understand, heard adults speak, or absorbed household tensions they could not interpret at the time. Many years later, those former children may be able to describe what they knew in a different way, not because memory has become perfect, but because adulthood gives context to old impressions. This is a delicate area. Childhood memories can be vivid and unreliable at once, and family stories heard over the years can blend with what was actually seen. Still, a careful investigator does not dismiss former children as sources, because cases involving neighborhoods often live in the memories of young people who were close to the ground of ordinary life. The detective may ask what they remember about that day, but also what they remember about the days after. Who was frightened? Who stopped letting children play outside? Who talked too much? Who seemed unusually quiet? Who moved? Who argued? Who had a vehicle that disappeared? Who made comments that sounded strange only later? These questions do not accuse. They explore the social echo of an event. The days after a disappearance can reveal things the event itself concealed. People react, alter routines, offer help, avoid attention, repeat rumors, or disclose private fears. Most reactions are innocent, and grief can make people behave oddly. But investigators sometimes find that the aftermath contains clues to what someone knew, feared, or tried to hide. Again, caution matters. Odd behavior is not proof, and ordinary people under stress often behave in ways that look unusual when viewed through suspicion. The investigator must ask whether a behavior is supported by additional facts, whether it is explainable, and whether it truly belongs to the case or only to the complicated human atmosphere around it. That atmosphere would have been heavy in Mesa after Mikelle vanished. Parents would have looked longer down the street, children would have been called inside earlier, and the sound of an ice cream truck may have carried a different feeling for people who knew the story. A neighborhood can recover its routines, but recovery does not mean forgetting, and some sounds may remain altered for years. Investigators, too, can be altered by a case. A missing child case tests a person's sense of usefulness because the desire to help is immediate and the barriers can be immense. When no answer comes, the investigator may have to learn a form of professional grief that is quieter than the family's grief and never equal to it, but present all the same. That professional grief must be managed carefully. It cannot become cynicism, and it cannot become obsession that clouds judgment. It has to become steadiness, a willingness to continue doing necessary tasks without allowing disappointment to make the work careless. A cold case unit, at its best, offers a structure for that steadiness. It gives old files a place to be reviewed, families a point of contact, and investigators a framework for deciding which cases can benefit from new attention. Resources are never unlimited, and that fact is painful, but structure helps ensure that old cases are not dependent only on chance remembrance. When a case like Mikelle's is reviewed, the detective may prepare a summary for internal use. That summary would likely include the known timeline, investigative steps already completed, evidence status, persons of interest, public leads, and recommended next actions. Such a document is not the case itself, but a guide for movement, a way of turning a large file into a workable path. Writing a summary is an act of interpretation, and that makes it important to write carefully. What is emphasized may shape what future investigators notice, and what is omitted may quietly disappear from attention. A good summary is therefore not merely brief, it is faithful, making clear where the evidence is strong, where it is uncertain, and where further review may be warranted. The hardest summaries are the ones that must say the case remains open with no definitive conclusion. The words are simple, but they carry years. They acknowledge effort without resolution, and they ask the next reader not to mistake the absence of a conclusion for the absence of work. In a way, every continuation of the investigation is a response to that sentence. The case remains open, so someone reads. The case remains open, so someone calls. The case remains open, so someone compares the old file to a new lead, a new method, or a new recollection. There is humility in the phrase remains open. It does not promise that the case will be solved, but it refuses to call the unknown settled. It leaves a small lamp burning in a room where people have spent many years waiting. If you are the listener placed gently inside this investigation, perhaps you are sitting now beside that lamp, with the file arranged in front of you and the night moving quietly outside the window. You are not hurrying, because hurrying would only make the pages blur. You turn them slowly, and as you turn them, you understand that each page belongs to a child who deserved to come home, and to people who have kept looking long after the first search ended. You might pause over the family's public appeals, because they reveal a different kind of evidence. Not evidence of what happened, but evidence of what love does in the absence of an answer. Love repeats the name. Love corrects the record. Love speaks to reporters when speaking is painful, and love asks strangers to remember a child they never met. That love can be difficult for investigators to face, because it raises the stakes of every conversation. A family does not want an abstract update. They want the truth. And if the truth is not available, they want to know that the search for it is still honest. The detective cannot heal the absence, but they can avoid adding to it through neglect, vagueness, or false reassurance. False reassurance is a subtle danger. It can sound kind in the moment, but later it becomes another disappointment when the promised movement does not arrive. Better, in the long run, to speak plainly and gently, to say what can be said, to protect what must be protected, and to admit when the case has not yielded what everyone hoped. Plain gentleness is also useful with witnesses. A person may feel guilt for not coming forward sooner, even when what they know is minor or uncertain. The investigator's task is not to punish hesitation first, but to understand it, because shame can close a mouth that careful listening might open. People delay speaking for many reasons. They may fear involvement, doubt their memory, distrust police, worry about family, or believe the detail is too small after so many years. When they finally come forward, the investigator has to separate the emotional story of the delay from the factual value of the information, giving neither more weight than it deserves. This is one of the reasons cold case interviews can take time. The detective is not only collecting facts, but helping a person walk back through years of silence. That walk may be uneven, and the person may stop often, correcting themselves, remembering something differently, or asking whether what they are saying could really matter. The answer often is that it might, not because every memory is important, but because no one outside the full file can know which small item may connect to another. The detective can thank the person, document carefully, and then do the quieter work of testing the statement against the known record. Testing is where patience becomes protection. It protects the investigation from error, the witness from overstatement, the family from false hope, and any named person from unfair harm. A tested lead may grow stronger, weaker, or simply remain unresolved, but at least it has been treated with the seriousness the case deserves. In the end, seriousness is not the same as severity. A serious retelling can be soft, and a soft voice can still tell the truth. The Mikelle Biggs investigation asks for that kind of voice, because its central facts are painful enough without embellishment. It asks for a voice that can describe the street without making it ominous, the bicycle without making it symbolic beyond recognition, and the long years without pretending that patience has been easy. It asks for a voice willing to say that the unknown remains, while also noticing all the people who have refused to let the unknown become abandonment. The refusal to abandon a case can be found in mundane acts. A detective checks a name, a clerk retrieves a box, a family member answers another question, a reporter confirms a date before publishing, a former neighbor thinks carefully before calling. None of these acts, by itself, completes the story. Together, though, they form the long human chain by which an unresolved case is held above forgetting. Each hand holds only a little weight for a little while, and then another hand takes hold. This is how old mysteries endure without becoming mere legends. They endure because someone keeps returning them to fact, to name, to place, to date, to the person at the center. In Mikelle's case, that means returning again to an 11-year-old girl in Mesa to the 2nd of January 1999, to East El Moro Avenue, and to the ordinary evening that became the beginning of a long search. A detective at the desk may close the map for the night, but the map does not vanish. It remains folded inside the file, waiting for the next review, the next question, the next careful comparison. The street remains where it is, changed by time and yet still carrying the memory of what investigators have asked of it. Outside the file, the city breathes in its ordinary way. Traffic moves, porch lights come on, winter evenings arrive and pass, and children grow into adults who may not know the full history beneath their neighborhood's quiet surfaces. The world continues as it must, but continuation is not erasure. Inside the file, the 2nd of January remains present. It remains not as a spectacle, but as a point of responsibility, a date that asks to be handled with accuracy and care. Every review begins somewhere, and in this case it begins there, in a small span of evening when the known facts narrow and the unanswered questions begin to widen. You let the page rest under your hand for a moment, not to dramatize it, but because some pages ask for stillness. Then you turn to the next report, and the work continues, steady, quiet, and unfinished. There may be no new line in the report, only the familiar sequence of facts, but a patient reader learns that familiarity itself can become part of the work. The page has been read before, perhaps many times, and still the eye returns to it differently, because time has changed the reader. A detective who once looked for urgency may later look for omission, and a detail that felt secondary during the first sweep may begin to matter after other possibilities have fallen away. This is one of the quiet disciplines of cold case work, the willingness to revisit the same words without assuming that the first understanding was the only understanding. Sometimes the work begins with a margin note, a small mark beside a name or a phrase that does not quite settle. It might be an address that needs one more verification, a witness whose statement was summarized rather than quoted, or a vehicle described too vaguely to mean much in the first days. The mark is not a revelation, and it does not change the case in a sudden way, but it creates a place for attention to rest, and attention is how an old file begins to breathe again. You can imagine the detective placing a clean sheet beside the old report, then writing the question as plainly as possible. Not who did this, not what happened in the largest and hardest sense, but what exactly was meant here, who recorded it, and whether it was ever checked against another source. Large questions can overwhelm a cold case, while small, precise questions can be worked, and sometimes the larger answer, if it ever comes, is built from a long row of small questions answered honestly. The file may include maps that have been copied so many times their lines have softened, and the detective may replace them with clearer versions while keeping the old ones nearby. Old maps show what investigators had in front of them then, while newer maps may show distances, property shapes, and routes with a crispness that makes comparison easier. Neither map is complete by itself, because the past is not exactly captured by paper, yet together they help a person think more fairly about what could be seen, reached, heard, or missed. When a case begins in a neighborhood, it remains tied to the habits of that neighborhood in ways that can be hard to describe. There are people who park in the same place each evening, children who follow the same sidewalk to a friend's house, dogs that bark at certain vehicles, and porch lights that come on just as the sky turns blue-gray. Investigators learn to ask about such habits because a disruption only becomes visible when the ordinary pattern is known, and the ordinary pattern is often kept in memory by people who did not know they were keeping anything important. In the Mikelle Biggs case, the ordinary pattern included children outside near home, a sister nearby, and a family expecting the evening to continue normally. That normality matters because it shaped everyone's attention before the disappearance was known. People were not watching for danger. They were making dinner, coming home, listening for children, moving through the last small tasks of the day, and because of that, their memories had to be gathered from the edges of ordinary life. A detective returning years later must treat those edges gently. If you ask someone what they saw on an ordinary evening decades ago, the honest answer may be almost nothing, even if they were standing only a few houses away. But if you ask what they were doing, who was with them, what they usually saw from that window, and what they remember learning afterward, the shape of the evening may slowly return, not as a perfect picture, but as a set of places where a useful detail might still rest. The careful interviewer understands that memory often comes through association. A person remembers the smell of dinner, then the kitchen window, then the angle of the street, then a sound that seemed normal at the time. Another person remembers a television program interrupted by a call from a neighbor, or a parent stepping outside, or the sudden knowledge that children who had been playing nearby were being asked to come in. These fragments are not answers, but they belong to the environment in which an answer may be hidden. The difficulty is that old memories can also be shaped by all the years of hearing the story retold. Someone may picture Mikelle's bicycle because they saw it themselves, or because it appeared in news coverage, or because the image became part of the neighborhood's shared recollection. The detective listens for this distinction, asking not only what is remembered, but when it was first remembered, and whether the person can separate the original moment from the later story that gathered around it. That kind of questioning requires tact. You cannot say, simply, that a person's memory may not be their own, because memory is personal and people often feel protective of it. Instead, you ask gently how they came to know a detail, whether they saw it firsthand, heard it from a family member, learned it from police, or read it later in an article. The goal is not to embarrass them, but to label each piece correctly so that the file knows the difference between observation, hearsay, and public information. In a cold case, correct labels are a form of respect. They prevent one person's uncertainty from becoming another person's fact. They allow later investigators to weigh statements fairly, and they keep the case from drifting into legend, where everything sounds meaningful because nothing has been tied firmly to its source. There is also the matter of silence, which can have many meanings. A person who did not speak in the first weeks may have known nothing, or may have been afraid, or may have assumed someone else had already reported the same thing. Years later, silence can look suspicious from the outside, but inside an investigation it must be approached as a question, because human beings stay quiet for reasons that are often complicated, and not all of them point toward guilt. A patient detective can sometimes make room for a silence to end. They may speak with someone who was young at the time, or dependent on adults, or worried about family consequences, or unsure whether a memory mattered. The detective does not need to dramatize the moment. They only need to make it safe enough for the person to tell the truth as they understand it, and then disciplined enough to test that truth with care. Testing a late statement can be difficult because the physical world that could once confirm it may have changed. A house may be remodeled, a vehicle may be gone, a telephone record may no longer exist, and people who could verify a conversation may no longer be alive. Still, a late statement can sometimes be compared with fixed points, such as addresses, dates, school records, work schedules, property histories, or earlier reports that quietly support or weaken what is being said. The old file becomes a measuring instrument. It cannot answer every question, but it can tell whether a new statement fits the known shape of the case, or whether it strains that shape in ways that require caution. If the statement contains a detail never released publicly, it may deserve special attention, though even then, investigators must ask whether the detail could have traveled through informal channels over the years. There are no easy shortcuts in this kind of work. A lead that feels promising still has to be walked step by step, and a lead that feels unlikely may still need enough attention to be responsibly closed. The detective's feelings may help them notice, but they cannot be allowed to decide. That discipline becomes even more important when the public has formed its own theories. In long unsolved cases, theories can become communities of their own, with people comparing timelines, old articles, and fragments of information that may or may not be accurate. Some of this attention is sincere and respectful, and sometimes it helps preserve awareness, but it can also harden uncertainty into confident narratives that the evidence has not earned. An investigator cannot work for the approval of those narratives. They have to return to the file, to the statements, to the evidence logs, to what can be checked and what cannot. It may make the official work seem slower than public discussion, but slowness is often the price of staying honest when so many people want the case to become clear before it has become clear. You might think of the investigation as a long table where every item must remain in its proper place. The bicycle belongs near the last known point. The ice cream truck's sound belongs in the circumstances of why the children were outside. The timeline belongs with the statements that support it. and each publicly discussed person belongs only where evidence places them. If one item is moved too far or made to carry more meaning than it can bear, the whole table becomes harder to read. A cold case detective may spend hours simply restoring that order. They may remove duplicate tips from a working list, correct misspelled names, mark which leads were checked, identify which conclusions were only assumptions, and prepare a clearer version for the next stage of review. This may sound almost clerical, but in an old case, clarity can be an investigative act, because confusion is one of the ways time hides the truth. The act of typing an old, handwritten note into a modern system can feel small, yet it can change how the file can be searched. A name once buried on a page may become discoverable beside another name, or an address may connect to a record that earlier detectives did not have easy access to. It is not glamorous work, and no one outside the room may ever know it happened. But sometimes the path into a cold case begins with transcription. As pages become searchable, the detective may notice repetition that had not been visible before. A certain street name appears in unrelated tips, or a certain description returns with slight variations, or a person's name shows up in a witness list and again in another context years later. Repetition alone does not prove importance, but it invites attention. And attention asks whether the repetition is coincidence, rumor, or a real thread running through the case. Threads can be deceptive. Pull too hard and the whole cloth may distort. Ignore them entirely, and a pattern may remain hidden. So the detective pulls gently. They check one source against another, look for dates, look for independent origins, and ask whether two similar tips came from separate observations or from the same rumor, traveling through different mouths. The work is patient because the file deserves not only effort, but restraint. There is a special kind of care involved in reading names that never became public. Most people in a case file are not suspects in any meaningful sense. They are witnesses, neighbors, callers, relatives, workers, or people whose lives happen to pass near an investigation. A responsible detective protects them from unnecessary exposure because an old case should not become an excuse to scatter suspicion across people whose only connection may have been proximity. This protection is part of why unresolved cases can feel opaque from the outside. The public may want to know everything, but everything includes the private lives of many people who were interviewed, checked, and perhaps cleared long ago. The investigation has obligations in several directions at once, and one of them is to avoid turning ordinary citizens into permanent shadows in someone else's story. The person at the center, of course, remains Mikelle. The child in the red shirt and blue jeans is not a symbol invented by the case, but a real person whose life was interrupted in a way no investigation has publicly explained. Every technical step, every database search, every re-interview, and every file review should return finally to that fact, because technique without remembrance can become empty. Remembrance, however, must be steady rather than ornamental. It does not need exaggerated language. It needs accuracy, repetition, and the refusal to let the case be treated as old merely because the calendar has turned many times. In families, remembrance takes forms that investigators may never see. It may be a photograph kept in a room, a birthday marked quietly, a conversation that stops for a moment when Mikelle's name comes up, or a box of clippings saved because the world's record feels too fragile unless someone keeps their own. These family archives exist beside official archives, warmer and more painful, holding not only what happened, but who she was. A detective who understands that will approach the family not as an obstacle, not as a source of pressure, but as people who have carried the longest part of the investigation. They may know the public history of the case more intimately than anyone, and they may also know which rumors have wounded, which reports were mistaken, and which details matter most to the person Mikelle was. Listening to a family does not replace investigative testing, but it can deepen the investigator's sense of responsibility. Responsibility also includes knowing how to ask for help. Law enforcement agencies may consult outside experts, other jurisdictions, forensic laboratories, missing child organizations, or analysts who specialize in old records and patterns. Each consultation is a way of admitting that a case may need more than one set of eyes, and that humility can be useful when a file has resisted resolution for many years. At times, the best outside help may come from someone with no emotional attachment to the original investigation. A fresh analyst can read a file without inheriting every assumption, noticing gaps that those close to the case have learned to step around. Yet fresh eyes still need guidance, because a person who does not know the case's emotional and factual history may accidentally revive a path that was already walked with great care. So, the handoff matters. The experienced investigator explains what is known, what has been done, what remains sensitive, and where the file may still hold promise. The fresh reader brings curiosity, while the experienced reader brings memory, and between them, the case may gain a little more balance. Balance is needed because old cases can tilt toward either certainty or despair. Certainty arrives too soon when people decide they already know, and despair arrives when people decide nothing can ever be known. The patient investigator stands between those two, refusing both the comfort of premature answers and the heaviness of giving up. That middle place is not always comfortable. It asks a person to say maybe, not because they are indifferent, but because maybe is the only truthful word until evidence gives permission for more. It asks them to keep the file open without pretending that openness is the same as progress, and to keep hope alive without allowing hope to become a claim. There is an almost monastic quality to this kind of work, especially in the quieter hours. The detective reads, compares, notes, and returns, not because the page rewards them immediately, but because the act itself is part of keeping faith with the case. The reward, if it comes, may come years later, perhaps to someone else entirely, and still the work must be done well. You can imagine a detective making a call to a retired officer who worked the early investigation. The retired officer may remember some things clearly, other things only generally, and some things not at all. They may recall the mood of the room, the scale of the search, a lead that once seemed important, or the frustration of too many possibilities and too few anchors. Such conversations can be valuable, but they too must be labeled carefully. A retired investigator's memory is informed by experience, but also shaped by time, and what they remember may blend with what they later learned. Still, institutional memory can fill in why a decision was made, why a lead was deprioritized, or why a detail that looks neglected on paper was actually explored in ways the written record did not fully capture. The written record is never the whole investigation. It is the part that survived in official form. Around it are conversations, instincts, weather, exhaustion, family meetings, search coordination, and small decisions made by people under pressure, many of which may never have been described fully enough for a later reader. This is why judgment should be gentle when looking backward. It is easy, from the quiet distance of years, to say what should have been done, but the first days of a child's disappearance are crowded with competing needs. A fair cold case review can identify missed opportunities without forgetting that early investigators were working inside urgency, uncertainty, and the limits of their time. A good review honors both truths. It says the original work mattered, and it also says the file can still be improved. It holds respect and scrutiny together, because only together do they serve the case well. As time passes, the cultural context of a case also changes. What communities expect from police, what families expect from public communication, what technology can provide, and how missing child cases circulate through media have all shifted since 1999. A cold case detective must understand the original context without being trapped by it, because the case belongs to its time and also to the present moment of review. In 1999, the spread of information depended more heavily on television, newspapers, flyers, and organized community outreach. Today, a missing child's photograph can travel widely in minutes, though speed brings its own challenges of misinformation and overload. Looking back, investigators have to recognize that the first search for Mikelle happened under communication conditions that were more physical, more local, and slower in ways that shaped every lead. That slower communication may have limited immediate reach, but it may also mean that old local memories remain especially important. People who lived nearby, drove nearby, delivered nearby, worked nearby, or had family nearby may have noticed details that never entered the broader public record. The challenge is finding them after so much time and asking questions in a way that respects both the years and the uncertainty. A delivery driver, A store employee, a teenager walking home, a parent returning from errands, a person visiting relatives, each could have held one small angle on the evening. Most may have known nothing, and some may have been contacted long ago, but the detective's task is to know which contacts were made and which remain assumptions. In all cases, assumptions can become invisible, so part of the work is making them visible again. You write down the assumptions. The truck was here, the time was exact, the street was quiet, everyone nearby was contacted. No one saw anything. Each sentence may be partly true, fully true, or too broad, and a careful investigator asks what documents support it before allowing it to remain in the working version of the case. This process can feel slow, almost beyond patience. Yet slowness is the point. A rushed review can reproduce the same gaps it was meant to find, while a measured review can reveal that some long-standing certainty was really a convenient summary. Convenient summaries are useful for public understanding, but dangerous inside an investigation if they replace the underlying facts. The phrase, "last seen around 6 o'clock" may be necessary, but inside the file, the detective wants to know who gave the time, how close the estimate was, whether clocks were checked, and whether different accounts give different shades of the same moment. The public phrase is a handle. The investigative question is the door. The same is true of place. Near her home is true in a broad sense, but the file must ask exactly where, from whose perspective, and with what physical markers. A few feet can matter in evaluating visibility, timing, and opportunity. And while an old case may not allow perfect precision, it still asks for the best precision the record can support. Precision can feel almost gentle when it is used correctly. It does not shout. It lowers its voice, points to the exact line, and says, "This is what we know, no more and no less." That kind of precision also protects Mikelle's story from distortion. Over years, retellings can add flourishes, simplify tensions, or make uncertainties sound settled, especially when people are trying to hold attention. But a calm case file resists that, not by being cold, but by returning again and again to the smallest reliable truths. A smallest reliable truth can be powerful. A child was last known outside her home. Her bicycle was found. Her family searched, police investigated. The case remained unresolved in the public record for many years. These sentences do not satisfy the heart, but they keep the ground firm beneath the feet. From that firm ground, careful questions can rise. Who was nearby? What was seen? What was heard? What was checked? What remains checkable? The questions are plain because the case does not need ornament. It needs clarity. The quietest part of the work may come after a lead fails. A detective closes a notebook, updates the file, and perhaps tells the family that nothing new came from that avenue. There is no ceremony for that kind of ending, and yet it is repeated many times in a long investigation, each small disappointment absorbed into the larger responsibility to continue. The family may receive such news with grace, frustration, sadness, or exhaustion, and all of those responses would be understandable. Decades of waiting can make every possibility heavy, because a lead is never only a lead. It is a moment when the future briefly changes shape. When the lead fades, the future returns to its former outline, and the waiting begins again. Detectives who work with families learn that they cannot control this emotional cycle. They can only be honest within it, careful not to heighten expectation unnecessarily, and careful not to withdraw so much that the family feels left alone with the file. Professional boundaries and human compassion must coexist, which is not always simple, but it is necessary. The community, too, experiences a quieter version of this cycle when a case receives renewed attention. People hear that there may be a development, they wonder whether the long question is nearing an answer, and then, if nothing public follows, the case settles again into memory. This settling is not abandonment, but it can feel like a slow dimming, which is why renewed factual reminders matter. A reminder can be as simple as a missing person page kept current, an anniversary article written accurately, or a police statement asking for information without exaggeration. These reminders keep the case visible enough that someone with knowledge may still recognize the opportunity to speak. Visibility, when handled respectfully, becomes part of the investigation's long patience. Respectful visibility avoids turning Mikelle's disappearance into a spectacle of fear. It does not need to make parents afraid all over again, and it does not need to make the neighborhood into a haunted place. It can simply say that a child is missing, that questions remain, and that information, even after many years, may still have value. There is strength in that simplicity. It leaves room for grief without feeding panic, and it leaves room for hope without pretending the answer is near. It lets the case remain human. Humanity is the thread that runs through every level of the investigation. The witnesses are human, with imperfect memories. The detectives are human, with limited time and real emotional burdens. The family is human, living with a loss that public language can never fully hold. Even the person who may know the truth is human, which means the path to an answer may pass through fear, guilt, loyalty, self-protection, or the complicated ways people live with what they have done or what they know. A patient investigator understands that truth is not always withheld in a single dramatic silence. It can be buried under family pressure, old fear, shame, confusion, misplaced loyalty, or the belief that speaking now cannot possibly help. The work of many years may be to create the conditions in which someone finally understands that speaking can still matter. That message has to be repeated carefully. If you know something, even something small, it may still matter. If you thought someone else had already said it, say it anyway. If you were young then and understand it differently now, there is still a place for your memory. Such words are not dramatic, but they are among the most important in cold case work. They open the door without forcing anyone through it. They remind people that time does not erase responsibility, and that the passage of years can sometimes make honesty more possible rather than less. Still, the investigator cannot depend only on someone speaking. They must also keep examining what is already present, because the file may contain more than anyone remembers. An old note, a misfiled report, a photograph taken for one reason that shows something else, or a lead closed too quickly under early pressure, can all become meaningful when revisited with mature attention. Photographs, especially, can ask to be looked at slowly. A scene photograph records more than the photographer intended, preserving backgrounds, distances, shadows, objects, and relationships among things. In an old case, a photograph may help answer where something stood, what could be seen, or how a location felt in physical terms before later changes altered it. The detective examining such an image does not need to make it mysterious. They simply studies it with care, perhaps using enlargement or comparison, looking not for a cinematic secret, but for practical information. A curb, a driveway, a wall, a window, a parked car, a line of sight, each may help restore the realness of the place. That realness is important because a case can become almost abstract after many retellings. The child becomes a photograph, the street becomes a phrase, and the investigation becomes a summary. Returning to physical details resists abstraction, reminding the investigator that everything happened somewhere, in air and light, among houses where people lived. You can think of the old scene as a room that no longer exists exactly as it was, yet can still be approached through records. The room contains the temperature of the evening, the fading light, the sound that drew attention, the ordinary movements of family and neighbors, and the sudden absence that changed everything. The detective cannot step fully inside it, but they can stand at its threshold and measure carefully. That measuring includes the emotional temperature as well as the physical one. How quickly did fear rise? Who was called first? When did neighbors join? When did police arrive? When did the search become organized? Each question helps show how the first response unfolded, and the first response often shapes all that follows. Early chaos does not mean early failure. It means people were responding to something frightening and unclear. The job of later review is to understand that chaos, extract what can still be trusted, and identify where the fog may have hidden something useful. Fog is a fitting image for some cold cases, though it should be used softly. Not darkness exactly, and not emptiness, but a condition in which shapes are present without being fully distinct. The investigator waits for the air to clear, and when it does not clear by itself, they move slowly enough not to stumble over what may be there. Mikelle's case has had many years of such careful movement. Publicly, the answer has not emerged, but the effort itself has left a record of searching, remembering, reviewing, and asking again. That effort matters because it shows that an unresolved case is not necessarily a forgotten case, and that the absence of a conclusion is not the same as the absence of devotion. Devotion may sound like a personal word for professional work, but in cold cases it can be accurate when used modestly. It does not mean sentiment replacing method. It means method, sustained by a sense that the person at the center is worthy of continued care. Every time the file is opened, that worth is affirmed. Every accurate retelling affirms it. Every respectful question affirms it. Every refusal to turn uncertainty into spectacle affirms it. The night grows quieter around the imagined desk, and the file remains open beneath the lamplight. The detective has not solved it tonight, and perhaps did not expect to, but the case has been held carefully for another stretch of time. A name has been checked, a detail has been clarified, a question has been written in the margin, and sometimes that is how the long work continues. Tomorrow, another call may be made, another record may be requested, another old assumption may be tested, and if no answer comes tomorrow, the work does not become meaningless. It becomes part of the long chain of attention that has carried Mikelle's case from that winter evening into the present, one careful handoff at a time. The file is still asking its quiet questions, and the people who listen are still learning how to hear them,